So as I said in the previous audio video, I was doing some thinking while I was, working and all that, in my department area or my section area of the warehouse, the shipping area. And I was thinking, about something that I'm not sure if anybody brought this up because it's never really been talked about, except for, maybe one moment. And that is, of course, G.I. Joe the movie, and the moment that pretty much got retconned, if you will, kind of rectified or fixed or pretty much safeguarded. And that was Duke going into a coma when initially, in actuality, he had died. And several dubs of the film pretty much make that clear. And even Buzz Dixon, who worked on the movie, in the script, if you will, made that clear as well in the commentary that, basically Duke was originally supposed to die, but because of the backlash that Hasbro got because of Optimus Prime dying in Transformers the movie, they pretty much put the kibosh on that potentially happening, and they went in the direction of, let's keep Duke alive, instead, and instead of having him dead, he'll just go into a coma. But it did get me thinking, I'm not really sure if there's any information out there. But it did get me thinking, if there's one thing that Transformers and G.I. Joe had in common with both the films, is that a lot of the mainstay characters that we all knew and loved from the first couple of seasons were pretty much taken out of the picture. Now in Transformers, we know that a lot of them were pretty much killed off. We know that. As well as we know some were captured by Unicron, I'm tired, I do apologize if I made it sound a little weird there. But we know that some of them were, captured by Unicron and pretty much being, set to be put into this melting pot, which is kind of like looked at as his stomach, if you will. So we know they were pretty much taken out of the picture to put the main focus, if you will, on the newer characters. And basically that's the same for G.I. Joe. The same could be applied for G.I. Joe the movie, because you had the new characters, I can't think of the group name right now, but it was the same applied for the new characters there that were being trained by Beachhead, and also led by Falcon, Lieutenant Falcon, which was Duke's brother. Basically, long story short that I'm getting at, essentially, is they had a common trait, and that is taking out the established characters to focus on the new ones. But what's interesting, though, is G.I. Joe the movie, despite the fact for the retcon of Duke going from dying to coma, we never really had any real significant death of any of the characters, if you will. And it got me thinking if in reality that was the plan. If maybe the idea from the get-go was to kill off some of the characters, in some capacity. And I was thinking, while I was working today, I was thinking, what if they were planning to do that? But just like with the Duke situation, and it being changed because of the Optimus Prime death backlash, you got to wonder if the backlash of all the other Transformer G1 characters that got killed off in the movie, also caused, the people like Buzz Dixon and his crew to essentially basically say, we're not going to kill these characters off anymore. Instead, we're just going to do something like, have them get mummified and be put into a hibernated mummification cocoon, and be basically part of this plant, basically become part of the plant, the Cacano tree or whatever they called them, or the Baroness called them in the movie. It's like, we'll just make them like that and have them essentially just suffocate or have the life force drained out of them until they're dead, which didn't happen. They would just, put to sleep, put into a hibernated sleep or whatever until, I guess, Cobra decided what they were going to do with them. I don't know. But, you have to wonder if maybe, them ending up in that kind of scenario was a result if you will, was a result of the backlash, as I mentioned, that Transformers the movie got because of the character deaths of Optimus Prime and the other G1 Season 1 and 2 Transformers. You got to wonder. You really got to wonder, because it just feels weird that, you take certain characters like, some of the, like, let's say Roblox Clue, that consisted of Lady J and Swift Kick and, Snake Eyes and, Shipwreck. I'm trying to find the right words to say. And Snow Job, and all them. You have to wonder. You have to wonder if they were originally meant to be killed off, in the movie, but instead were pretty much, kept alive, but put into this hibernated mummification state, to where, basically maybe the life force was going to be slowly drained. Because the one thing I did notice is it seemed that the characters that were imprisoned the longest in that mummified state, that cocoon mummified state, seemed a little weaker than the other Joes that got captured later on, like Hawk and Scarlet and Sergeant Slaughter and so on. It makes you wonder if that, if that's probably the closest we were going to get, because, you had one Joe get punched by a Cobra fighter. I can't think of his name, but he's related to like something like what Barbecue does, or it's Fire or something. And maybe it's Blowtorch, I don't know. And then you had Lady J fall, kind of trip and fall, instead of escaping for the lives, trying to run for the lives from, the destruction of Kobalah. You got to wonder if maybe the idea was, and again, maybe there were some stories that they were going to follow through on in the DIC/Wildbrain, entertainment continuation of the G1 series, sequel, continuation of the movie. You got to wonder if maybe there was going to be more information given, we just weren't given it. You have to wonder. That's what I'm trying to say. And you have to kind of ask yourself if maybe, them being put into this kind of scenario, if you will, this kind of scenario, like I said, was an answer to, basically, was an answer, basically to, not, dealing with, backlash ever again, or backlash once again with killing off certain characters. I'm just saying. Again, I do apologize if it sounds like I'm all over the place. I'm tired. Like I said, I work today, so I do apologize. But you have to wonder. If, there was more to the G.I. Joe movie than, just what we got. Because it seemed like with G.I. Joe the movie, the 87 film, they played it safe. To an extent. It was still a movie that, by today's standards, would probably warrant a PG, maybe slightly light PG-13. Like I was saying, mainly, when you look at how, certain characters like Lady J, and then that one Joe character that's like a firefighter or whatever, kind of get, like that firefighter Joe basically getting punched by a Cobra thing, and then Lady J tripping and falling, while they're escaping the explosion of Kobalah. It makes you think that, it makes you think if there could have been more that they had planned, especially with the sequel series. But like I said, I think they just wanted to, I think they just wanted to, basically play it safe after what happened with Transformers the movie. But when you really think of how everything went down, in this film, you have to truly believe that they had more darker intentions, in mind, outside of, the OG idea of Duke dying and everything, that they had more darker intentions. In fact, I was even thinking about this the other day. Well, not the other day, but I was thinking about this earlier today while I was working. What if the idea was after, the Joes get recaptured, after they're trying to escape Kobalah, they get recaptured by these trees and pretty much cocoon, mummified into, a deep sleep, deep coma, hibernation, what have you. Who's to say that basically the idea wouldn't be, and this goes back to what I was talking about with Lady J, what if it was to drain out the life force, right? Kind of make them weak over time, drain out the life force, and slowly kill them. Well, I was thinking, what if one of the original ideas, not saying this was an idea, but I'm thinking to myself that if the movie was meant to be a little darker, kind of like Transformers, what if one of the ideas they had, planned out, but they, again, probably shelved. And again, let me point this out. I'm not saying this is something they had originally planned, but I'm just theorizing, I'm speculating if maybe this was something they were thinking about. What if the idea was to take, that one Joe character during the final battle in Cobra La, where he gets punched by that Cobra character? What if, the Cobra La soldier, if you will? What if the idea was it would, that character, that one character, like again, that is the only Joe that pretty much gets, his butt kicked by a Cobra La soldier. What if the idea was that he would be the only character outside of like the main characters that would die, potentially outside of Duke. And what I mean is, what would happen if, to show a demonstration of their power, they would have him get completely wrapped up, be the first one, and then kind of show the power that they have by having this tree, these vines, kind of slowly, I wouldn't say slowly digested, but do it in a way to where you see, slowly the body impression that he has, the mummified body impression that he has, kind of slowly shrink away, and then all of a sudden the vines just open up, and then you see nothing but, his clothes, his uniform, or his character uniform, if you will, and maybe bits of, bodily fluid, crystal, sparkly bodily fluid, whatever you want to call it, as well as maybe a few skeletal remains, just fall to the ground, indicating that he was killed. He was killed off by being digested into the plant. So you have to think of, you have to think and speculate, was that potentially an idea they were going to go for? Because why have the characters, get captured and mummified and all that in a cocoon, pretty much put, while also being put into like a deep sleep and everything, if you weren't planning maybe something more with them, more with that reasoning. I mean, at least, Friendship is Magic, when they had Chrysalis do what she did in the season 6 finale, to, Celestial, Luna, Cadence, the main 6, and then later on most of the, I guess you could say the Suppression Squad-like group, who started out at first as helping, and then they got slowly captured except for Starlight, and then they got cocooned. You have to ask yourself if the plan was for something similar to occur, because like I said, even in Friendship is Magic, Chrysalis's plan initially for her hive was to suck the love, so basically the life force, out of Twilight and the main characters. So again, you have to think if maybe there was something similar that was planned. Essentially, what was it like now? 20, 30 years ago, or 30, 29, 30 years prior is what I'm trying to say. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm tired. I work today. But you have to wonder. You have to wonder if maybe that's what they had planned. And you have to speculate if maybe the idea was to demonstrate visually on screen what would happen to the Joes if they tried to escape again, or if they just didn't accept their fate, as being prisoners of Cobra La or something like that. You got to wonder. You got to wonder. So, to me, I was just thinking about that today. Wondering if maybe G.I. Joe the movie was meant to be a lot more darker than we thought. Basically, outside of the Duke situation. If there was more to it than, they had planned. And if maybe the sequel series, that followed after the movie, that was done by Deke Entertainment, Wild Brain Entertainment, instead of Sumbo, you gotta wonder if maybe it would have been addressed there, like with Lady J and her dyeing her hair blonde and everything instead of keeping it brunette. You gotta wonder if maybe the reason she did that is because of the PTSD she got from pretty much being put in that situation, being one of the Joes that got captured, mummified, put into a deep sleep hibernation with the potential that the life force was slowly being drained, which would explain again why she fell during the escape from Coppola's destruction and everything. You know, you have to wonder if maybe that would have been explained, maybe not. Again, just spitballing here as to what potentially could have been, you know, with G.I. Joe the movie and maybe even the aftermath of the sequel series. But, you know, let me know what your thoughts are, guys. Do you think I'm just grasping for straws, or do you think maybe G.I. Joe the movie was meant to be a little darker outside of what the OG Duke death was going to be? Do you think there was more to the story than what we saw? And do you think maybe because of the backlash for Transformers movie, they played it safe? Let me know what your thoughts are, guys, in the comment section below, as well as in the live chat down up here if you haven't already. Like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, click on the links in the description to find my content also outside of YouTube. Also click on the last link to go to my Teespring store for merchandise you can't get anywhere else. And again, guys, I do apologize if I'm sounding a little all over the place. I'm tired. I did work, and yeah, I do apologize. But let me know what your thoughts are, and until then, I am out.